I think this is a profound question, and we face a paradox here. Because on the one hand, as I've testified in executive session, and as I stated both in my speech to the American Legion and again in my testimony here, the statement you have read represents essentially my views. At the same time, we face the difficulty that a perceived inferiority, as I've also pointed out in my statement, could have political consequences or diplomatic consequences. So therefore, both sides not only want to be equal, they want to be perceived to be equal. And you get many discussions of what happens when one side is slightly behind, or even somewhat behind, and you ask, what are you going to do with these weapons? The answer then is the diplomatic impact. I would have to say that if each side keeps multiplying its weapon systems, the consequences which I foretold are very probable. That each side will have to justify its military outlays by the perception that the other side is trying to threaten its national survival with its arms programs. That in turn makes cooperative projects almost appear to be absurd. And the argument is inevitable, that there's no sense having economic relations with a country that at the same time is building military capabilities whose only purpose can be to threaten your national survival. Therefore, I believe that the answer to your question is best brought about through negotiated agreements in which both sides put first a ceiling on their forces and then agree on reductions, so that the perceptions work in favor of the arms limitations. The difficulty with unilateral limitations is that they then deprive the other side of any incentive to agree to these negotiated restraints. But in general, we ought to look at our strategic programs with great thoughtfulness, both in terms of their impact on the overall environment and in terms of whether they are the best military users of a limited defense budget.
I'd like to ask one other question. My time isn't up. It is up.
Yes, I'm ready now, Mr. Chairman. If I may. Mr. Chairman, I apologize for being late, but I have a slight distraction.
Senator Jacob Javits of New York.
Days, which required my presence there this morning. Mr. Secretary, I join my colleagues in welcoming you. I have thumbed through your statement. I did not hear your testimony. Hence, if any question that I ask is duplicative or represents something in which you may have changed a meaning by your oral testimony, please help me by correcting me. Mr. Secretary, I notice in a very quick review a rather a very understandable omission here that doesn't seem to deal very much with Europe. For example, I notice a reference on page 13 to the fact that President Ford has assigned the highest priority to maintaining the vitality of our partnerships in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. And then as I went through it, I hardly saw anything about Western Europe, which you and the President have characterized as our primary allies. Now, I'm sure that doesn't represent any change in our policy, and I ask the question so that you may highlight for us where you see Western Europe fitting into the broad effort to arrive at what's called détente with the Soviet Union.
Well, actually, Senator Javits, in order to prevent some of our European friends from feeling neglected again, we have dealt with Europe again later in the statement on pages 41 and 42, in which the point is made that we consider the relationship between Europe and the United States an absolutely essential ingredient to détente. And that, moreover, we think that in the relationship between Europe and the United States, there should develop a commitment that prevents East-West relations from appearing to the publics on all sides as the dramatic element of foreign policy. Rather that the relationships in the Atlantic, and for that matter with Japan as well, should have the constructive, should be perceived to be, and in fact be, creative and adequate to the future. So we consider our relationship with Europe absolutely central. We will give it a great deal of attention, but we will also remember what happened when we were too importunate.
The other line of questioning I'd like to engage in with you is the matter of the so-called Jackson Amendment. Now, I notice a rather, to me, interesting statement at page 22 in which you say, quote, "This sudden ex post facto form of linkage raises serious question." And that matter, that worries me because it sort of goes back to what we call square one. Isn't it a fact that you are well on the way to a resolution of the Jackson Amendment?
That is correct. The first part of the statement, Senator Chavez, deals with the history of the relationship. Then the second part of the statement deals with where we are going from here. As I have testified before the committee, I believe we are within sight of a settlement of this issue, and in fact, in the statement on page 44, I indicate this. I hope that within the very near future, we can come to a conclusion on this.
Well,
I think I agree with you that we are very close.
I call that to your attention because one would not wish a signal to go up that there's some change of course on the Jackson Amendment, because I could take very grave issue with you, which I don't think would be productive in terms of what we're heading toward, upon some of the conclusions which are stated here. For example, you say we recognize the depth and validity of the moral concerns expressed by those who oppose or put conditions on expanded trade with the USSR. But a sense of proportion must be maintained about the leverage our economic relations give us with the USSR. Well, it's just as broad as it long, is it not, Mr. Secretary? That if our economic relations don't give us much leverage, they don't give us much leverage in détente, and they may not be worth kicking out the window moral concerns in order to attain them. We can't have it both ways.
Well, the argument for beginning these economic relations is to establish a set of commitments on both sides which will create vested interests in a restrained international behavior. The issue of the most favored nations treatment of the Soviet Union, I think by general agreement, will not lead to a very substantial expansion of trade. Most people estimate that it will not exceed 15%. However, it is of political significance in the sense that it is an element of discrimination and therefore has a political and symbolic significance transcending its intrinsic importance.
So that if it got the MFN, the important thing to the Soviet Union is a certain sense of respectability, equality with 100 other nations.
That's correct.
So haven't we a right to equate respectability with morality in terms of what they're doing to a lot of their people in the Soviet Union? They don't hesitate to kick us around, and haven't for 50 years, about how we treat the blacks in the United States or the Japanese or other ethnic groups.
But, Senator Chavez, as you know, the attempt of this administration has been to promote some of the objectives, in fact, all of the objectives which concern you. After all, the rate of emigration from the Soviet Union went from 400 in 1969 to well over 20,000 in 1972 before this debate ever started. So it cannot be said that we were indifferent to the issue.
But
now,
isn't it true that since the Soviet has turned the petcock the other way as it easily can, and it's now down to between 12 and 15,000 from 35 in the preceding year?
That is correct. And then the question, then one would have to debate what the causes of that turndown are. I personally believe, Senator, that given the fact that we are fairly close to an agreement, that it would probably produce more acrimony if we debate the responsibility for the turndown from 35,000, which existed and which was guaranteed, to a lower figure, and the attempts that are now being made to increase it.
Well, I agree with the Secretary, and that's why I was rather taken aback by the strength of the point. I won't even call it an attack for the reasons the Secretary has explained at page 22. But I'm perfectly satisfied, but I did want the record to show that this isn't as one-sided a case as it looked in the early part of your statement by a long sight.
If I could call the attention of the Senator to a statement on page 44, which says that I believe that both the executive and the Congress, each playing its proper role, has been effective with respect to the immigration issue. And I might also point out that the original date for these hearings was August 8th.
And also, Mr. Secretary, I'd like to note that we will depend very heavily upon the Secretary and the President in respect of whatever is agreed to. And therefore, I have no desire to break down the relationship. But I was disturbed a bit by the statement which I noted. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, you've been here a long time, and I gather you're supposed to appear before our party.
Senator Hubert
caucus
Humphrey.
Very shortly, so I'll try to get right at what I have
Of
in
your
mind.
party, Senator.
Sir?
Of your party.
Yes, of our party. We welcome you. You're more than welcome. You might find yourself in more happy circumstances there than you've been where you've been. The former Secretary of State, Mr. Rusk, in testifying here, as is noted by our chairman in his opening statement, indicated that, and I quote him, that detente is not a condition in which all problems are solved, but a process by which points in dispute are resolved and potential crises are anticipated and avoided. I think that's a very pertinent and constructive definition of what we mean by detente. And I think it's important to emphasize it, because what I sense here is that we expect, just by merely saying that we're pursuing a detente, that all at once that everything falls in place, that there are expectations greater than what the long period of difficulties in the Cold War and before that might have brought about. But having said that, there are some things that you'd like to see carried out. For example, I'll just pick a few that are very minor, but I think they're indicative of the problems that you face and that we face. I have a story here that of the September 6th. It says, U.S. experts drop Soviet grain survey. Now, there surely isn't anything of any great political dynamism in a team of agricultural experts looking into the grain production of the Soviet Union. In light of our experience with the Soviet Union, and in light of the fact that they could step into the American market tomorrow morning and buy up 500 million bushels of wheat before we even batted an eye, and this country would be in an economic tailspin. Now, that, by the way, still isn't understood by the American public, but it is a fact of law, and it could happen. Why isn't the Soviet Union keeping its agreement with us that was signed over here on the agricultural information, statistical information, and crop reporting? This is of vital importance today, Mr. Secretary, because the time bomb on President Ford's desk is not some of the things that were asked in the last press conference. There's one question on the economy out of 22. But the time bomb is inflation. And the biggest item of inflation that is today beyond the comprehension of the American people is food. We're going to keep at this in every hearing that I have, because I've been dead right for 2 years, and I'm going to keep at it. We're going to get somebody around this town interested in it after a while before it's too late. Now, why isn't the Soviet Union willing to open up?
First, Senator, you've gotten me interested in the problem.
Yes, sir.
But it's a new subject for me, so it's taken me some time to learn. As you saw in the President's speech yesterday, and as you will see, I hope to your satisfaction at the World Food Conference, which we have supported, we will put before the world community our conception of what is, I agree with you, one of the fundamental problems that the world faces today. And in this respect, we believe that cooperation by the Soviet Union is extremely important when you talk about reserves, when you talk about the needs of the least developed. And we will make our view with respect to that very clear, both before the conference and at the conference. And I hope, in fact, to have the benefit of some discussions with you before we all go to this conference. Now, in general, in our relations with the Soviet Union, I do not want to be here as an apologist for every Soviet action.
I understand that.
We are dealing with a system that has a long history of keeping its information very secret, that considers, wrongly in my view, reports about its agricultural condition as affecting its national security, and we have therefore had great difficulty first getting an agreement to exchange crop reports at all. And then getting this, and then we ran into this particular difficulty. It was caused in part by the fact that our group came really at a time earlier than the Soviet Union wanted them, and probably wanted to see some things that would have shown certain weaknesses in the agricultural production this year, particularly in the virgin lands which they wanted to visit. This does not excuse the action. We thought it was unfortunate, and we would expect that as détente develops, that such things as exchange of information about crops would not be considered an aspect of foreign policy, but an aspect of how to deal with a world problem on a common basis. We have not yet reached that point.
I thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, I don't want to sound like an old saw in this business, but I know that the newsmen that are here are much more interested in the number of nuclear weapons. But they're apt not to be used, we hope. But I can tell you that the Soviets, the largest wheat-producing country in the world, and if we don't know what their crop statistics are, and we permit our markets to be free and open, this country stands the chance of being in an economic catastrophe. And I've just got to bear down on it as a public servant. I spent 20 years of my life in this field, and I can tell you that the information that we're not getting is of critical importance, because we have no way of judging what we can afford to ship abroad until we know what the crop conditions are in at least the Soviet Union and possibly in the PRC, but more so the Soviet Union.
I agree with you that a common world food policy is one of the imperatives before the world today. And we are working very hard to develop an adequate American response, and as you know, this is a subject which is new to us also.
Yes.
I mean, as a country. But I agree that the Soviet Union must be, in one way or another, related to this, or it becomes very difficult to implement.
Mr. Secretary, again, looking at the process that we're pursuing, which I fully support, the process of détente, the East Germans slowed down traffic some time ago, as you may recall, in West Germany. I mean, between East and West Berlin. Our government, I understand, withheld diplomatic recognition for a while. Were the Soviets of any help at all in reconciling those differences that seem to crop up there?
Well, I think that the harassment on access routes, which was actually rather minor,
yes,
but to which we strongly objected because we resisted principle, was triggered in part by the establishment of the Environmental Office in West Berlin. Now, it is our view, we support the position of the Federal Republic, that it has the right to establish such offices. The Soviet Union, I cannot honestly say the Soviet Union was of much help. It's hard to judge what the role of the Soviet Union in this was. It never escalated to the point of an acute crisis in which one was able to judge exactly what the role of the Soviet Union was.
There is a feeling, and I've shared it at times, I'm not sure that I fully accept it, in reference to Export-Import Bank loans to the Soviet Union. And here's the scenario, that if the Soviet Union can borrow from us and also from our private banks at rates that are substantially less than what domestic borrowers can get, that this permits the Soviets to divert capital that they could use in their own domestic economy to their military. And that in turn, of course, permits those who want to see our military expand to say we've got to catch up with the Soviets, so that we in turn then have to plow in, or asked in the Congress to plow in more money into the Pentagon appropriations and expenditures. It's a simple way, I mean, it's a complex way of saying that we're financing their military expansion and ours. There may be some merit to this, and I have been concerned about it.
Well,
what is your observation?
Well, in an economy of the complexity and the size of the Soviet Union, it would be wrong to say that that resources that are freed by one activity cannot be used for another activity. On the other hand, my impression is that the Soviet, if you look at Soviet history, even when there was no trade at all, the Soviet military budget was at very substantial levels, and they seem to determine what they think they need, set that aside for military purposes, and then devote the remainder to the civilian economy. So probably the primary impact of the credits we give is to ease the life of the Soviet citizens, which may or may not have an impact on the political situation. So I would not, on the whole, believe that there are major diversions for military programs that would not be undertaken except for the American assistance. At the same time, I must say that it will be very difficult for us to give substantial credits to the Soviet Union under conditions of an unrestrained arms race. Because whether or not there are diversions, it is not easy to explain why they couldn't divert the other way, that if they want to help their civilian population, why they shouldn't cut their military programs. And this is why I believe that for us to be able to exercise both the restraining influence on political tension and achieve the beneficial effects of trade, a ceiling and then a turn down in the arms race is absolutely essential.
I would have others, but you have to go, and I want to say to you, Mr. Secretary, that it's no easy task to balance off all these conflicting interests of senators and nations.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, may I make a request? I want to ask a question. Yes, you can talk. The request I was going to make is I had mine questioning the Secretary about the relation of Russian shipments of armaments into the Middle East and the seeming intractability of the OPEC nations. Now, that's a very sensitive subject. May I ask, Mr. Chairman, through the chair, whether the Secretary might not feel disposed to give us an executive session on that or subjects which...
I would like to discuss this whole subject.
I want to join on that. I had that question, but I felt it would take more time than when we had here today, and I believe it's terribly important.
Maybe next week, if that suits the chairman.
And I hope nothing I've said, Mr. Secretary, makes the Secretary feel that we have any deep differences about the Jackson Amendment. I hope it's going to go the proper way.
Quite candidly, part of this was written at a time when progress was less noticeable.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know that it'd be improper, because I wanted to ask one question in this connection, because it's already been mentioned, the accelerating arms race, the infusion of arms on both sides. And there seems to be no progress in the diplomatic. Why has this progress stopped since the disengagement agreements? There's a feeling that a momentum, which you so ably created, has stopped.
In the Middle East.
Give us any assessment of this?
No, I think, Mr. Chairman, that that it was always expected that after the Syrian disengagement, particularly in light of the fact that a new government was taking over in Israel, that there would be some interval to permit the disengagement to be carried out, to permit active consultations to take place. And basically, we are about on the schedule that had always been expected. In the process, the tensions in the press, at least, between Syria and Israel have caught public attention. On the other hand, I must say that when the various Arab leaders were here, their expressions were rather moderate, and we had talks which we considered constructive in the direction of negotiations with the Israeli Prime Minister when he was here. As you know, I'm planning to take a quick trip to the Middle East in October, and we do not feel that a stalemate exists or that the momentum has been lost. We are now shifting from a phase of disengagement to a phase where we're beginning to construct the peace settlements. It's less, what happens now is less under the impact of military operations and more geared to achieving the permanent solution that must be our ultimate aim. So we had to have rather extensive consultations, and which so far seem to us to be on course. After this trip to the Middle East, we will be in a better position to judge what the realistic prospects may be. But right now, we don't feel a stalemate exists.
You don't think there are any obstacles to proceeding to the negotiation of further agreements to the present time?
No.
Is there anything that the Congress can do or isn't doing or is doing that would in any way contribute to that?
Well, we have the sense, which may be, which I think is correct, that the Congress is in general support of the effort to foster these negotiations and recognizes the difficulties that exist on all sides. And to the extent that the Congress lets this be known, it is helpful, but I believe that a wide consensus exists on that.
Is it still our policy to try to bring about a diplomatic settlement there on the basis of the resolution of 1967?
Yes, we support the implementation of Resolution 242 and 339.
And that is generally understood by all parties.
I think it is understood by all parties, and I think all parties also understand that this has to proceed step by step. And this was, in fact, the purpose of the consultations in August, to make sure that all parties understood the general approach that would be used.
Is it not probable that if this settlement can be made, that the lowering of the price can be negotiated, especially with the Saudi Arabians? Have they not indicated that that would be their policy?
Well, certainly the opposite is likely, that if there is another flare-up in the Middle East, that the impact of this on prices or even more on supply could be very serious.
But you don't think that it
Well,
could be the other way?
It is also true that as we are making progress towards peace, the attitude of at least some of the oil producers has become more moderate. If I compare the positions, for example, of Saudi Arabia last year at this time with the position it took at the recent OPEC meeting, one has to say that there is a correlation between the political conditions in the Middle East and the attitude of some of the chief oil suppliers towards the whole question.
Well, that was my understanding, that if it could be brought about, that there was at least an opportunity for negotiating more reasonable prices, particularly with regard to the Saudis, because they being the largest producer and traditionally the most favorable to the Americans. Has that not been true?
Certainly, Saudi Arabia has a predisposition to be favorable to the United States, and I think, as I pointed out, that as we make progress towards peace, the economic issues become easier to deal with, too.
And
I don't think it has to wait for the final accomplishment of peace.
No, but with an assurance that the it can be done is what they still need. And that's what is so important about the momentum being maintained. And so you feel fairly confident that when you go out, you can at least give us some further evidence that it's resumed.
Well, the difficulty in the Middle East is that in almost any other negotiation, as you begin to make progress, it gets easier. In the Middle East, as you begin to make progress, it gets more difficult.
Why is that?
Well, that is because you approach more and more complicated issues in which the feelings of both sides run deeper and deeper. Nevertheless, to answer your basic question, I am hopeful that we can make progress. It will be complicated, but having now talked to all of the parties, I believe that progress can be made, and I think that after I've been in the Middle East, we can form a...
One last question. There was a column in yesterday's paper that I personally don't know about, but I think is misleading, that the request for $4 billion in 1 year was made recently by the Prime Minister of Israel. Is that correct or incorrect?
Well, I see these speculations, and sometimes they confuse estimates of national budgets with what is going to be asked of the United States. The fact of the matter is that any substantial request would obviously have to be submitted to Congress, and we are not going to submit any such request to this session of the Congress, and we will have to look at this whole problem again in the light of conditions that may exist in the new Congress. But this sum was based on a confusion.
Well, that's what I thought it was. It was the Evans column yesterday, I thought, would not be accurate. Well,
I'm afraid to read this column these days. I'm afraid to read this column these days.
Well, if it's as inaccurate as I assume that is, I agree. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
Senator Fulbright has apparently adjourned the hearing, and Secretary of State Kissinger is continuing on to a meeting with the Democratic caucus in the Senate. You have been listening to part of a series of hearings before the Committee on Foreign Relations of the Senate, a debate on détente. And the witness this morning was the Secretary of State, the Honorable Henry Kissinger. We've been broadcasting this hearing from the Dirksen Office Building, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing room. The program was made possible with funds provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I'm Linda Wertheimer, and this is NPR, National Public Radio.